how the component architecture, how the refactor is going, because we kind of started about a month ago. This main.go was all of the game code, and like in short, really the game is just the main function with a loop. I think any game kind of works similar. You have input, update, render, but we had like a lot of code in this file, and it was getting really not dry. Like we were repeating ourselves a whole lot, and a refactor was needed. So that prompted us, and from there we've kind of got some cool stuff going on. We now have a lot of different concepts. Like we have engines that these are like the doers. The things in the game are like game structs. So anything that's like an actor in most game engines, whether it be a player, an enemy, a projectile, those are considered structs. And structs interact with engines, which kind of are the doers. Like you have collision engine, yada yada yada. I have implemented these director modules. So it's just kind of an interesting little component architecture. Now I did run into one thing I didn't really think about that kind of skipped my mind. Kind of giving a small explanation to why there's directors and engines. Why don't the structs, like these game components, interact directly with the engines, the doers, is because engines can act on structs, but structs, if they act on engines directly, you get a dependency loop, and the game won't compile. So to get around that, I introduced this tertiary module grouping, which is really kind of a good abstraction, really, is what it becomes. But structs act on directors, and directors orchestrate what engines need to be operated on. What that might look like is like a player saying, hey, I'm going to attack. And the player attacking, like attack method on the player object, we'll call like maybe the combat director, and the combat director will probably have to go to a couple engines and say, hey, I got work for you. We don't get dependency loops that way. But going to models, I ran into a small issue. Directors and engines both have to have some common language to communicate with. In other words, they need some type of structure, like structs, to pass back and forth so they can talk in like a common way. So any class that like a director may call an engine and then the engine return some data structure, that will become this model. This is so shared data structures between directors and engines are models, and then structures, like the difference between a model and a struct is really just a struct is more like a game entity, like a player, an enemy, and a model is more like a data transfer object. I'm thinking in Java, but it's kind of like, you know, you're transferring data between two class types. One way I kind of like to think about this, and I'm rambling at this point, but I like to think that one day, if this became like a multiplayer game with a server side, engines would be the back-end code, directors would be kind of the client's API to talk to the back-end code. That might help some people like kind of think of that, but kind of complex. But this is setting up the architecture of the game where like now we can add a bunch of features without getting like code overload, where there's stupid huge files with really bad, I guess what you call component architecture. So I'm excited to like start adding a ton of features now that it's not all in one file and it's kind of clean. I think there's still about 300 lines of code in main.go. So I think there were over 1,000 when I first started the refactor. Added a bunch of code in scope of that. So we're about 77, it's maybe 70+% of the way done with the refactor, and it's starting to look a lot better. I have a lot of these functions collapsed. You can tell input is still like a really big function, but I just keep it collapsed for readability.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That makes sense, yeah. All right.
Any obvious questions you think somebody might have, Andrew? Anything you want me to go over?
No, it was. I mean, I was getting confused on the directors, but your last comment on after you said you were rambling is a good.
Yeah.
Good way the API interaction makes a lot more sense.
That's what it could become. It's not that way now. It's.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I mean, that's a good way to visualize. I'm tracking. Yeah.
I think in the future, it would probably be kind of me to make a small diagram to represent the way these interact with each other. Maybe it would be slightly easier to understand. Awesome.
Maybe for next stream.
Yeah, just talk about the component architecture for an hour.
Just
bore the.
I'm sure that'll be just as boring as the last refactor we attempted on stream.
Yeah, when we tried to implement the component architecture, that was a bomb. Like it just what It was boring. I feel bad for anybody that watched.